Hey, Next Economy Now listeners. If you followed our podcast for long, you've probably heard about the Next Economy MBA. What you might not know is that we wrote a book about it, and it's coming out on May 23rd. The Next Economy MBA book combines our experience working with Next Economy organizations and over 400 alumni that have taken our course. It's designed for impact leaders who seek to develop a business strategy from a socially just and environmentally regenerative perspective. This book is a great way to dive deeper into the principles and case stories we discuss on the podcast and includes a workbook to put learnings from the program into practice. You can pre-order a copy for yourself or a friend at lifteconomy.com/MBA book. Thanks for listening. And now, on to the show.
Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Erin Axelrod, a partner worker owner at Lift Economy, and I'm so pleased today to be joined by Jacqueline Novogratz. She is the founder and CEO of Acumen and a recognized leader in the social impact space, a global community that fights poverty and builds dignity by investing in companies using both philanthropy-backed pioneer investing and for-profit impact funds. Acumen has impacted nearly 443 million people across Africa, Latin America, South Asia, and the United States. Jacqueline is also the author of 2 award-winning books, the best-selling The Blue Sweater in 2010 and Manifesto for a Moral Revolution, Practices to Build a Better World in 2020. She is a member of the B Team and serves on numerous boards and advisory boards and has been named, among other things, one of the top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy, one of Insider's Climate Action 30 leaders, one of the 25 smartest people of the decade by the Daily Beast. Jacqueline, such an honor to welcome you to the show.
Thanks so much, Erin. It's such an honor for me to be here.
So, where is home for you right now?
So technically, New York City. However, one of my favorite lines in literature is from Marguerite Yourcenar's amazing book, The Memoirs of Hadrian, in which Hadrian at some point says, "I am at home everywhere and nowhere." And I remember reading that and thinking that that was me. I grew up as a military kid who moved almost every year and then continued with a peripatetic life, given my love of the world and solving tough problems of poverty. Having built Acumen now for 22 years with local teams on the ground has meant building deep relationship and community in the places in which we work, whether it's in Pakistan or East Africa or India, West Africa, Latin America. And so whenever I'm in any of those places, I'm home.
I love that. And it reminds me, actually, you were on another podcast recently, and you also shared one of your favorite speakers at COP was a young woman from India who said something to the effect of, "I am a child of India. I am a child of Earth." How do you think this kind of global connection to that more global sense of home has influenced your work?
Oh, deeply. I'm saddened, as I think most of us are, in this moment where we are dividing ourselves into camps. We're either globalists or we're nationalists. And this either or mentality is getting us to a, frankly, scary place. This is a moment truly for us to embrace nuance and reject dualities, if you will, the idea of dual, that it's either or. We have to embrace a both and mentality. And so when she said, "I'm a child of India, I'm a child of Earth," it was powerful for me because we gain our sense of identity from those around us, from where we are sitting. And yet our problems are not just global, but increasingly planetary in their dimensions. And so we have to be both. We have to take care of our communities and our families and our neighbors, and also recognize that all of our acts, from brushing our teeth to heating our water to putting on clothing, all of those acts are thanks to the work and toil of people we might never meet on the other side of the world. And the more we embrace both and take responsibility for both, the more we're able to navigate the complexity and possibility of our interdependent world.
So, Acumen, I'd love to have you share for listeners who Acumen is and what you've been up to, in case folks have not yet come across your incredible work.
Thanks for that, Erin. So I started Acumen in 2001 after spending time on Wall Street in Central Africa, where I started the first microfinance bank for women in Rwanda. And after really learning through experience the power of markets to create efficiencies and enable scale, but also to the deficits of overlooking low-income people, sometimes exploiting. And in the charitable sector, the power, humanitarian ethos and inclusion, and the deficit of creating dependency rather than freedom. And so Acumen was an attempt to take the best of both, ultimately by raising philanthropic capital, investing long-term, and we can talk about patient capital. We were able to create a nonprofit global organization whose very mission is to solve big problems of poverty and build a world of dignity. What do I mean by that? Build sustainable solutions to poverty that aren't about seeing low-income people as passive recipients waiting for handouts, but solving problems in ways that are financially sustainable and provide individuals choice and opportunity. We do three things. We have Acumen Ventures, which uses both patient capital, philanthropic backed, to focus on really early stage investments and enable them to grow. Then we have 4 for-profit impact funds that help us truly grow those companies, about $200 million under management. Then we have Acumen Academy, where we take the insights and the learning from what Acumen has gained over the last 22 years and share them with the world, built around a cohort of about 1,300 entrepreneurial builders, I would call them, who are also focused on finding those solutions. With our philanthropic-backed patient capital, we've invested about $150 million in about 150 companies and impacted almost 450 million low-income people.
So some of our listeners may not be familiar with patient capital, and you have been such a leader in this. I'm wondering if you could share, what is patient capital and why is it important?
Let me start with the why of patient capital. And I started to preface it at the very highest level, that our investing mechanisms often focus on taking high risk and therefore getting very, very high returns, whether it's 25% returns or 40 times returns on your investment, hoping that out of 10 investments that you make, maybe one will succeed in venture capital. When it comes to building markets that have never existed, like in off-grid solar energy, or building capability in communities that have been ravaged by war, where trust is low, where skills, for many good reasons, weren't fully developed. When it comes from fundamentally reintegrating supply chains so that the poorest, the weakest links of the supply chain are actually valued for the strength that they bring, all that requires overturning a status quo that doesn't want to change. When you add to it that the companies in which Acumen is focused, because we're focused on solving problems, are looking at customers who make $1, $2, $3 a day, then business as usual that is looking for very high financial returns is not going to invest. Patient capital helps solve that problem by recognizing that philanthropy should be where we see the highest risk capital. And yet it's so often where we see the least amount of risk taken. So what if we said you took that philanthropy and invested in early stage entrepreneurs that weren't focused on profit maximization, but were indeed focused on solving big problems of poverty in energy, in agriculture, in education, in healthcare? And what if you kept that money in those companies for 10 to 15 years to give those entrepreneurs time to try, fail, recalibrate until they get a business model that works for low income people? Then they're ready to scale. That patient capital allows them that time, that early stage investing. But that's not enough. Patient capital also assumes what we would call accompaniment, that we put in our financial capital and we accompany it with our social capital, our networks, our access to other supply chains, corporations, philanthropy, because grants are often needed as these companies build the legs so that they can finally run. We measure what matters, and any money that comes back to Acumen is reinvested in other innovation to solve problems of poverty. For every dollar that we invest, we see 4 to 5 additional dollars from increasingly traditional investors coming into our companies and into our markets. So while we've invested about $150 million, we've seen a good $650, $700 million above Acumen come in as follow-on capital. And so this is using the best of philanthropy to build sustainable companies that raise significant capital, that have great impact in the world, and have a sustainability mechanism, and that money comes back, not for private distribution to Acumen, but for reinvestment. And when we looked at the first 15 years of Acumen's patient investing, when our learning curve was very steep, we nonetheless were able to see about 91 cents on the dollar return to Acumen and watch companies create real systems change. We invested in an ambulance company with 9 ambulances. It was a long run, 15 years, a lot of accompaniment. But recently, after the company brought 50 million people to hospital and helped set the standards for emergency services across India, Acumen was repaid with real returns so that we now have additional capital to invest in innovation for the poor.
Incredible description. And it occurs to me that some of our listeners may also be following the excitement around this notion of catalytic capital, around some of those aspects you describe around how patient capital or that initial risk-tolerant capital can come in, seed the initial investment that actually paves the way for that follow-on capital to come in. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts to add around this role of catalytic capital too, and how you've seen that play out with your work at Acumen.
Absolutely. I don't have the exact analytics right now, but I remember when we were doing our patient capital report, one of the things that struck us is that in an overwhelming number of the investments that we have made over the last 22 years, overwhelming, we are either the very first investor or the first couple of investors. But in a majority of our companies, Acumen is that catalytic capital that is willing to go where others will not. In the United States, Abby Wamimo, who is a Nigerian immigrant, partnered with a guy named Samir Gowal, whose family immigrated to the United States from India. They created a company called Isusu, which had the insight that it's very difficult to get credit in the United States because it's very difficult to create a credit record. And it's sort of a chicken and an egg cycle that people get caught in. And so Isusu, taking a cue from informal credit systems in Nigeria, allows people to build their credit repayment record through rental payments. And Abby tells the story of going to, he says, 300 different investors, and finally getting to a point where he and Samir had racked up all of their credit cards, were almost giving up when they came to Acumen with this business idea, which fit right into our sweet spot of standing with the poor, using capital to build financially viable companies that could release the human energy of low-income people, create new kinds of markets and opportunities. And so we took a bet, and I think it was about a year ago when the company raised a Series A with a $1 billion valuation. And so if you imagine, if no one had ever taken a bet on these guys, that model that was so important, particularly during the pandemic, where we learned so much about the vulnerability of, frankly, not just low-income Americans, but a lot of middle America. It wouldn't have happened had there not been that catalytic capital, which now has many, many partners and supporters, which is really exciting.
That is very exciting. It occurs to me that going back to some of the things you mentioned around Acumen, positioning as problem solvers, really at the core, that's what you help support entrepreneurs to do, that there's kind of this maybe intransient paradigm that you've been facing where much of dominant culture, particularly around investing, is around profit making. I guess my question is, how have you navigated kind of that paradigm of encountering such strong values around profit making, financial profit maximization, by bringing this ethos of solving real problems that people are encountering right now?
That's such a great question. Gandhi had a great saying, which is that first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. I would say for the first 5 years, we were just ignored. Everyone thought it was crazy what we were doing. About 2007, 8, you started to see the first impact investors come in. And to your point, a number of them would say, we love what Acumen's doing, but we're not so sure it's real. We can do the same thing and get you 20% returns. That was a complex period because the idea of Acumen and patient capital was so new then. And you can imagine people who truly believed in capitalism as it was, hearing a story that felt more comfortable to them, say to me, well, I think what you're doing is really noble, but these guys over there say they're going to do the same thing and they're going to get me 20%. So why would I give you philanthropy? And I'd say, but they're assuming that there are no trade-offs, but we are not going to solve world hunger for the lowest income earners in the world and get you a 20% return. Just think about this. And lost a lot of arguments. And I think that is part of what it means to be a true social entrepreneur that rejects a status quo. That in those early years, you'll see other players come into the space with a greater ease of narrative. And since you haven't fully proved out what you do yet anyway, it's really easy for them to offer a counter narrative that's more comfortable. And so I would say there was a period of soul searching and asking myself, are we just making excuses? Or do I know that this is a very viable segment of the market, not the only segment? And at that point, already probably 20 years of experience, I had to conclude that it may not be the only truth, but that this was my truth. And that if you started by standing with the poor and you saw capital as a means, not as an end to solving these problems, and you believed that one powerful way of solving them was to build profitable companies that could get there, recognizing that in the early stages, it was expensive work to do, then you needed philanthropy. And so lots of sleepless nights, made the decision to stand in that space, even though it was very difficult. And if you look at Acumen's manifesto, that's where we have a line that we do what's right, not what's easy. But you have to struggle and wrestle with, are you being stubborn because that is what you thought would be the right way? Or are you remaining true to what you are actually seeing and experiencing? And the good news is today you see lots of entities that recognize the need for a true patient capital, specifically in, I'd say, 3, 4 really big categories. One, when you're creating a market that's never existed. Off-grid solar. 2007, there was no off-grid solar for the poor. 1.5 billion people had no access to electricity. They relied on kerosene. No one knew how to price, to distribute, to finance. Low-income communities had no trust. And those same communities where there was no electricity, nor was there solar availability, were serviced by kerosene mafias and diesel mafias who had no interest in seeing a new entrant, even if it was clean, better, and ultimately less expensive. And so to make companies work there with customers who make $2 or $3 a day required a different kind of capital than traditional investors are used to investing, patient capital. The second category is very, very low trust areas. Go to a place like Gulu, northern Uganda, decimated by 20 years of civil war, where over 1 million people who lived in internally displaced persons camps come back to an area with literally 2 generations who haven't been trained in the skills of farming. And you're starting over. So patient capital to build the skills, to build the trust, to enable the capability for, in this case, a cotton gin, which today is the biggest employer in the area and has really helped transform that whole local economy. And the third, which is really exciting to me right now, is patient capital needed to start and build those companies that are disrupting existing supply chains in commodities like coffee and chocolate that have fully depended on futures trading, which is sort of crazy when you think about it, to price the coffee, prices that are paid to the farmers that actually grow the coffee, wherever they are in the world, right? You have one global price based on what happens in Brazil. You might be a rural farmer in Ethiopia going through a drought. It doesn't matter. You get that global market price. So there are new entrepreneurs coming in that are saying, wait a minute, what if we put the poor first? What if we understood their production costs? Could we actually identify a living wage for the farmers, make it transparent, put that on offer to buyers who could pass off much of that cost to the ultimate consumers? Build a new economic model for how coffee might work so that with every cup of coffee we're drinking, we're not keeping a farmer in poverty, which is what we're, for the most part, doing right now. That's hard to do because the status quo doesn't want to change. And so patient capital now, I have no sleepless nights. There is no apology. Now I look at patient capital as absolutely vital for certain market segments and certain geographies to enable those early stage entrepreneurs to create models that then can scale in partnership with traditional investors, or more likely, a combination of investors, government, and civil society.
Wow. Thank you for responding to these questions with such beautiful insights, but also powerful storytelling. I am so grateful for how you bring in the stories of the people and communities you connect with on the ground in your work. I have so many follow-up questions, and they stem from some of the themes we grapple with in our Next Economy MBA course. So one that's just coming to me is you talk a lot about people escaping, or I'm not sure exactly the words you use, but getting out of poverty. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more what that vision is, how that actually looks for communities on an individual, interpersonal, and community scale. And if there are aspects in the more than financial realm that you could bring into this discussion, because I sense often when we hear World Bank statistics around lifting people out of poverty, it's reduced down to just going from $1 a day to $3 a day. But I'm curious if there's aspects of reweaving interdependent self-reliant communities that we can't even.
Well, I just really so appreciate that you even went there. I was highly influenced in the 90s by the Nobel laureate economist Amartya Sen in his book Development as Freedom, in which he argues that income is important, but it's not enough. And that poverty is really defined as a lack of agency. It can be what he calls the unfreedoms, that if you may have a little bit of income, but you have no quality schools to which your children can go, your water is dirty, your healthcare is non-existent, your safety, security is at risk, you're unable to speak or marry someone not of your religion without getting killed. Those are also forms of impoverishment that hold you back from flourishing. And so I started to think about the opposite of poverty being not income or wealth, but dignity. All the things that Sen talks about. Are we building companies that are actually allowing people to contribute, to solve their own problems, to feel seen, to participate? And so where I see it, and it's where, as you said, it can be more nuanced than just, we brought water to 2 million people, period, end of story. Or our organization has given this much income to this many people, end of story. Take it to another level. When I started to really see change, people moving out of poverty, is when you start to see the whole conversation change and people treating you like an equal rather than in this weird power dynamic. So D-Light, the off-grid solar company that started in 2007, two guys with a solar lantern, see the scourge of kerosene and how dangerous and dirty and expensive and unhealthy it is for poor people, and so start to build a market. It takes 5-7 years just to get it going. Therefore, patient capital. We worked with them. Well, we're still invested in them. So 16 years later. But what I started to understand as D-Light went from a startup with a prototype, making every mistake in the book, to a company that was starting to understand how to price, how to distribute, to an ecosystem builder, because it was the first mover, it was the pioneer that helped launch an energy revolution. I'd say back in 2011, when it started to partner with cell phone banking. So you could pay on a daily basis for your solar energy, right? So now there's lots of players within, just in building D-Light, including what they called agents. So these are the young people they would hire to go door to door and sell solar lights, solar home systems. I remember visiting Nakuru, which is a beautiful town in Kenya, and meeting with some of the agents there who'd grown up in poverty. One woman named Everlyn, who grew up in a tribe where girls weren't allowed to go to school, but she had a renegade father, and she was quite tough herself and convinced her father to send her to another village where she had the downside of not growing up with her family and the upside of getting an education. Everlyn, another guy named Dixon, talked to me about what it felt like not only to make income, but to be part of solving one of their country's biggest problems. And the first thing they did after they started to earn significant income was, of course, support their family. But also, in the case of Dixon, I think he adopted 2 or 3 street children. Everlyn took it upon herself to ensure that her whole village was electrified before she went to college, so that she knew that she could make a contribution like that. So I start to see people not only moving out of physical poverty, but any sense of mindset impoverishment, because we do a good job as a world taking away people's courage and confidence. And I start looking at these young people and think, that African dream of giving back before you make a lot of money actually has something to teach the American dream. And that's where you start to see the real power of building these sustainable engines that happen to be companies, but to really grow, they often, as I said, have to partner with government. That's where you see that the whole system can shift people can start to imagine and build their own futures. And so now, if you would ask me in 2007, what's the future look like for this off-grid solar? I would have thought, oh my goodness, I don't even know if it's going to work. Now I would say we have a chance in countries in Africa that today have a 7-8% electrification rate to leapfrog fossil fuels altogether and grids. And imagine a world where every single rooftop has its own solar panel that will have generations and generations and generations of renewable energy on top of it. And that starts to build an ecosystem where you can imagine e-mobility and digital access and flat screen televisions, which are already in many of these villages, with just a few watts of solar energy, and people staying up at night, and solar sewing machines and solar irrigation machines, and on, where people are making their own lives in ways that make sense to them, in ways that are clean. I see that future in a way that I don't think I could have imagined it 15 years ago. And the fact that I can see it now is only possible because of the work that so many did for the last 15 years with this great moral imagination, this audacity of seeing the world that could be, but they had this humility to deal with the mess that they encountered and not give up, but persist through it and build the right kinds of market mechanisms and civil society mechanisms to make that world possible.
Boy, and as you're speaking to this vision of the decentralized renewable energy on every person's home, and especially the concept of leapfrogging, it makes me think of some of the struggles here in where I live in Northern California around, because the monopoly of PG&E has been so strong, there is actually a fight for folks that are advocates of cooperative solar energy to actually even retain or build the rights of decentralized solar renewable energy infrastructure that could cross property lines. Because as soon as you do a small community scale solar installation, you're now regulated as a utility. And so I'm just thinking about how the distinctness of place and how different communities are, regardless of in what region, the struggle to build that aspect of decentralized infrastructure it's such an incredible vision. Thank you for bringing us into that vision. And no matter where you are, I think there's different challenges to it.
Well, we have a fellow, Stephanie Spears, who actually started a company called Solstice in the United States, which is community solar, so that lower income people could get access to solar, even if they lived in a city and had no place to put panels on their own roof, an apartment building or what have you. And so I am very excited to see the different kinds of models that are showing up, and do believe it is a time to reimagine, and that distributed power not only is a metaphor at a larger scale level, but is so critical to a world of increasing fragility given what we're dealing with climate change.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for so much of that work and leadership in the thinking around supporting people to access that vision. I would love to go back to another tension that comes up in our MBA course, and would love to hear your thoughts. Earlier in the conversation, you were mentioning the notion around every time we turn on the tap here in the US or turn on the light switch, we're immediately transported into that connection, that global connection of the deeply consequential impact of how we are interrelated. And a question that comes up often in our MBA course is, how do you hold the seeming paradox of living in a globally interconnected world while also striving to regain much more bioregional sourcing of our direct essential needs, such as food, water, shelter, and energy, especially in the context of things like fair trade or consumer demand that can actually support and help these global countries in relation to purchasing from actual fair trade coffee or chocolate that can empower communities to have livelihoods. Does anything come to you around that seeming paradox or tension that you'd like to share? I think our listeners and our MBA alumni would be really, really interested in your perspective on that.
In some ways, it goes to what we were talking about before, that it is to all of us to be both local and global simultaneously in our action and in our awareness. I'm part of developing another project where we want to show what this more radically transparent capitalism could look like, where you have the opportunities both to buy from local makers and also, because of understanding pricing and approaches to environmental sustainability, things like chocolate and coffee, which typically are grown, whether it's Latin America, parts of Africa, or Asia, the two must coexist. And the through line is being more conscious about the decisions we make. And I know there's a big debate right now around ESG, et cetera, et cetera. To me, the more interesting question is why we wouldn't think about values and value in a more whole way when it comes to analyzing whether our investments actually add value to the world or just to shareholders, and frankly, our companies. If all we're doing is measuring shareholder return, then of course we will reinforce practices and habits that build shareholder returns within the context of an I win, you lose world. And I actually now, after almost 40 years of doing this, have seen so many opportunities of a world that takes a I can only win if you win approach, that it becomes a different mindset altogether. At Acumen, we talk about whether we are investing more than we extract. We still hope to see financial returns, but are we actually bringing more than we're taking? If we had that mindset in the way that we shop, in the way that we are in family, are in community, are citizens in the world rather than simply consumers in the world, I think all of our systems would start to change. Give more than you take.
Jacqueline, I could speak with you all day. This has been such a joy. Is there anything else you would like to share with our listeners, particularly about the new report that was released, or anything else that you'd like to leave our listeners with before we close?
Besides leaving your listeners with that idea of give more than you take, I would say that this is a moment for both action and reflection. We need these kinds of conversations. We need to demand more of our business leaders and of ourselves, not from a place fully of judgment, but from a solutions orientation. We need more entrepreneurial builders in the world who ask, what is the problem I am trying to solve first and foremost? And then figure out the right kind of capital, the right kind of organizational structure. And if we could move beyond ideology to that place, we'd have a much better chance of actually solving these problems. And so in my next chapter, I really hope to see us as part of a movement of individuals who truly do want to build those solutions, who find each other in the world, and who value human dignity at the center of our systems rather than simply profit. And then finally, if you want to be part of that community, of course, check out Acumen on acumen.org. But even more important, don't be afraid of starting. Just start. Let the work teach you and ask yourself not what happens if I fail, but what happens if I don't try.
Incredible to have you on the podcast today. We're so appreciative of your time and your years and years, decades of experience. Thank you for courageously doing this work and being at the forefront of so much that is critical towards building this just next economy. And we'll have to have you on again because there's so many questions we didn't get to, but thank you so much for today's conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Erin, and I really appreciate that this is the area that you are focused on and that you are giving voice to this conversation. I really appreciate it and wish you the best of luck.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.